Thanks. So good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank Asset Management Ontario for the opportunity to join you this morning. I'll be presenting on the City of Thunder Bay's Asset Management Plan, our climate adaptation strategy, some successes and lessons learned, and how we're moving to integrate these two. So Thunder Bay is located on the north shore of Lake Superior. It's about a 16-hour drive from Toronto, not the 4-hour drive to North Bay. We have a population of about 110,000 with sprawling infrastructure that was created by the amalgamation of Port Arthur and Fort William in 1970. So our asset management plan currently reports that the city manages about $3 billion in assets. So obviously this is important, and we want to make sure assets are performing well and as well as they can through their lifespan with the funding that we have available. Investing in those assets at the right time and prioritizing renewal when that work needs to be done. We started inventorying our core assets in 1990. We collected condition information on the assets as well. So depending on the asset, some of the condition ratings are pretty basic, from the poor, fair, good. And some of the other ones like roads, we use modeling for our condition assessments. You need to be able to maintain the information you have going forward, so consider the resources you have. This is what I mean by make it manageable. Students are a great resource for regular inspections, but you also need someone to review that data to decide on deterioration in investment cycles. Start with the industry averages. As you collect your data, then customize it to your infrastructure. As you can imagine, pavement in Florida that doesn't experience freeze thaws might last quite a bit longer than ours in Canada. So as you can, try to determine life cycles that work in your community. There's a lot of data that's required by the end of 2025 now to meet the asset management regulation OREG 58817. But acting on the asset management plan shouldn't wait until you have all the data and it's perfect. I see asset management plans as living documents that will be updated and continually improved. Even once a municipality meets OREG 588, you'll still be improving your condition rating systems, your deterioration curves, adding new asset classes, etc. So use it in whatever form you have to start to make decisions. One of the best things that happened when Thunder Bay had an asset management plan was that we could point to it when councillors or residents asked about their pet projects. And we could say, look, we have a plan. Your street's not scheduled to be repaved until another 6 years from now. It gave us the ability to stop putting other people's priorities first. So start using it, don't wait until it's perfect. And you'll also need to educate the council and the community on what asset management is and on your asset management plan, so that when you tell them that their street's not being paved for another 6 years, that they'll listen. They need to understand how we reduce life cycle cost of a road by completing interim investments of mill and paves, and not just waiting till a street needs to be fully reconstructed every time. They need to understand that you don't do the worst first, that we need to consider the risk to the city and the criticality of that infrastructure. It's far more important for an arterial to perform well than a residential street. The other thing that we found by educating council and the community is that they're willing to spend more money on infrastructure. They start to understand that if we keep pushing projects down the road, it will just be more expensive, that we need to reduce the infrastructure gap now. We've been successful in implementing a tax-funded enhanced infrastructure renewal program called EIRP, where residents saw their taxes increase to fund infrastructure rehabilitation projects. EIRP was introduced in 2011 at $2 million, and it grew by $2.5 million a year until it reached a peak of $9.5 million in 2014. In 2015, the funding level was reduced to $8.4 million, but it has stayed at this level. This is an additional $8.4 million that we have to spend on infrastructure renewal that we would not have had without an asset management plan and without using it to educate the community. We've also seen successes in this area where both councillors and citizens have stepped up at budget time when cuts are being proposed to argue to keep our infrastructure funding. Now I'll switch over to our climate adaptation strategy and talk about how it was created, our successes and lessons learned. Thunder Bay's climate adaptation strategy was developed over 3 years. It was prioritized in the aftermath of the city's 2012 flood, which saw numerous roads, homes, businesses, and the city's water pollution control plant flooded, which caused the city to declare a state of emergency. But people recognized that the city had seen other events as well, like hailstorms in 2011, where there was a lot of damage to homes and vehicles, major snow events in 2013 and 2014, and extreme cold temperatures in the winters of 2015 and 2016 that saw hundreds of water services to homes and businesses freeze. We followed ICLEI Canada's BARC 5 milestone framework. So ICLEI stands for Local Governments for Sustainability. So don't try to figure out that acronym because they changed their name. I kept the acronym. And BARC is Building Adaptive and Resilient Communities. So ICLEI is an international nonprofit that has established itself as a leading organization and expert in climate change planning. Their BARC framework provides a structured approach that is led by the city while incorporating multi-stakeholder involvement. Many stakeholders were involved in brainstorming how climate change could impact the community, not just infrastructure, but also, for example, lifestyle, economy, community health, and safety. We worked with a broad range of stakeholders during 12 workshops to determine 46 potential impacts. One of the impacts, for example, is potential increased service disruptions in utilities, transportation networks, and distribution systems with more frequent and severe weather events. So although this potential impact seems like it would apply to almost anywhere, that is not usually the case. Climate impacts and their corresponding adaptation actions are local, and they depend on stakeholder engagement to identify them. A climate adaptation plan for one community cannot be generalized to another. During the process, the 46 potential impacts identified by stakeholders were focused to 9 priority impacts and 45 climate adaptation actions that the city could employ. While identifying the city's adaptive actions, several unifying themes emerged. We identified stormwater management and urban forestry, which see multiple benefits. Emergency management as well. It's important to remember that part of adapting is recovering from an extreme event, so effective emergency management response is critical. Our infrastructure asset management, of course, and community planning as areas to focus on. So I've included a picture here of a bridge for one of our main arterials that we had to close during our 2012 flood. As you can imagine, we normally see significantly more freeboard than what's shown in this picture. The span on the right is actually a bike path under the bridge, so you have an idea of how much the water came up. So you can see why the community would see climate adaptation as important after an event like this. So I'd like to point out some of the successes that we've seen. Having gone through the ICLEI BARC process, we have a strategy that is a broad approach that avoids just preparing for the last disaster, but helps us prepare for the next disaster. Even though flooding was the impetus, other things like heat stress, invasive species, and water contamination were all identified in the process. Some of the greatest successes are in integrating climate adaptation throughout our corporate plans and policies. Climate impacts are systemic and are usually better addressed through integration rather than individual initiatives. So for example, adaptation is one of the 4 pillars of our official plan. We've also included it in our asset management policy, our stormwater management plan, as well as identifying new IDF curves for the city's stormwater system, also provides over 550 locations for low impact developments. These are green infrastructure like bioswales and infiltration galleries, which help improve both the quality and reduce the quantity of stormwater in our storm system, reducing requirements to upsize pipe networks. Climate adaptation has also been integrated into our emergency services, exercises and planning, and we're lucky to have champions in different departments throughout the city who have helped to drive progress forward. Thunder Bay has established a community partnership platform called Earth Care. Together, citizens, community groups, businesses, and the city work in focused groups to lead the community in securing the environmental health of the region. Earth Care has 11 working groups. So for example, there's a water working group, a food group, a waste working group, and a mobility working group. These bring people together around issues of sustainability, climate change, and a low carbon future. The Earth Care platform with community working groups provides ongoing collaboration and support from stakeholders. The City of Thunder Bay is also lucky to collaborate with like-minded partners who have similar goals, like our District Health Unit and an ENGO, EcoSuperior, who both have access to other sources of funding and have supported more flexible implementation of community education programs and rebates. One of the lessons learned is that climate impacts outside of the city impact Thunder Bay. So Thunder Bay is often called on to host evacuees from northern communities that are evacuated for forest fire, flooding, or infrastructure failure. Organizing and successfully hosting evacuees uses our emergency services, from fire resources, who normally support the evacuation centers directly with staff, to health resources to shelter locations. Another lessons learned is social impacts of climate change are extensive. Extreme weather particularly impacts the vulnerable populations, and social resilience is a broad protecting factor. This is something that many communities have seen with the compacting impact of COVID. This health emergency added on to an already tenuous support systems for the vulnerable populations in our community have resulted in a perfect storm situation that has shone a light on the importance of social resilience. To respond to this realization, we've included new social indicators that are tracked in our implementation plan. The low income measure from StatsCan has been included, as well as a sense of belonging, which is a question from our client, our citizen satisfaction survey. So these are now reported along with our infrastructure indicators. Tracking extreme events is important, but usually and hopefully these don't occur every year. So tracking the progress and not just the impacts is important. With our climate adaptation implementation plan, we can still report on progress and celebrate wins to keep moving forward. You don't just want to react with projects and policies to extreme events. Or as I said before, you're only planning for the last disaster, not the next one. And important for all municipalities because of scarce funding, we have learned that having strategies in place with defined projects make funding applications smoother, and community collaborations allow for broader access to funding to achieve strategic goals. So now I'll move on to integrating asset management and climate adaptation. So I've included some pictures of one of our LIDs. You'll also see the bridge that was closed in the background of the picture on the left during our 2012 flood. So for anyone not familiar with the concept, the picture on the right shows the curb cut that's designed to allow road runoff into the LID. Here, stormwater ponds and infiltrates into the soil, reducing water from adding to the peak flows in the storm system, as well as cleaning the stormwater. The stormwater runoff waters the plants in the LID, which are chosen to thrive in this type of condition, and as well as providing stormwater benefits. LIDs can also support trees and other vegetation that improve air quality, provide shade, and of course are also aesthetically pleasing. Sustainable management of the city's assets requires us to look at climate and how our assets need to adapt to the impacts of climate change, as well as how our assets may contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. The City of Thunder Bay is working to align our asset management with the city's climate adaptation and environmental sustainability goals. We're currently working to incorporate climate considerations in our core assets within our asset management plan, and we'll be broadening this scope once this has been completed. To help build understanding and capacity in integrating asset management and climate adaptation, the city participated in an initiative offered through the Federation of Canadian Municipalities called the Climate and Asset Management Initiative. Through that process, we created a cross-departmental committee that has been integral in the creation of our asset management policy, the governance framework, as well as now our asset management plan. Asset management touches on every department in the city, so that cross-departmental committee has been important to keeping everyone talking and on the same page. The participation in this network also allowed us to collaborate, share, and learn from 19 other municipalities across Canada. One important way to integrate asset management and climate adaptation is through design. If changing climate considerations are not considered during design, especially extreme weather, it can lead to reduced asset lifespan, and in some cases that would be catastrophically reduced, and can result in inadequate service levels for the rest of the life of that asset. So just putting back what is there results in improper infrastructure investment, resulting in shorter lifespans than expected of assets and exacerbating the infrastructure gap. As an example, I mentioned that the city has now developed IDF curves through our stormwater management plan to make sure we're designing for future storm events and not storm events that we've seen in the past. This type of consideration has to be applied to the design of all of our assets. Incorporating projected climate changes over the lifespan of an asset for service level risk assessment and maintenance estimates is also necessary for accurate funding. Your asset management plan cannot just look at replacing what is there, but needs to consider the costs of growth and climate. What should you be replacing that asset with, and what is the cost of that? This is something that Thunder Bay will be looking at as we update our service levels. Natural assets are key for both climate adaptation and asset management. An asset like the urban forest provides multiple services for the community, such as climate mitigation, stormwater management, urban heat island effect mitigation, carbon sequestration, and aesthetics. Recognizing these multiple services and quantifying the costs of replacement if more traditional infrastructure is used supports more educated development decisions and helps identify opportunities to protect or even augment the investment in this green infrastructure. OREG 588 doesn't require green infrastructure to be included in the asset management plan, but it is good to include it because it is an asset like any other infrastructure that you need to maintain so that it continue to provide benefits to the community. And of course, there's a cost to plant them and to maintain them. And trees are one of the only assets that I can think of that actually appreciate over time. And it's important for people to understand that. Having projects identified makes it easier to include in rehabilitation projects. For example, based on our stormwater management plan, Thunder Bay has over 550 locations of LIDs identified. This makes it easy to review when capital work is being completed in the area. And then we can include the installation of the LIDs with that project. Because of this, Thunder Bay has implemented over 30 LIDs. Having these identified upfront has made it easy to plan and include in the projects, and it's also easy to get funding for. Because we have a plan in place, it's easy to match projects with funding criteria that is available, whether that be detailed design or installation. So I'll finish with some suggestions that municipalities can do now to move your asset management and climate adaptation forward. So these are just highlights from the presentation. So use your asset management plan to advocate for infrastructure funding. It does work. Use a climate adaptation lens when developing and updating all of the city's policies and plans, and have lists of projects ready. It makes it easier to implement as well as easier to get funding.